I found these decorative wall hanging brackets at my thrift store, and I thought these would be really pretty put up in between the opening of my dining room and my foyer. I started by giving both of these a light sanding. They did have like some sticky stuff on them, so I ended up having to get all of that off before I could paint these with 2 coats of my black chalk paint. And I did have to use a tiny brush to get in between the smaller details of these. You could also just spray paint them. Once they were dry, I mixed up a little bit of this folk art bronzed metallic paint and just a little bit of dark brown paint because I felt like it was just too light and too yellowish, so I wanted to make it more bronzy. Then I decided to use this Tim Holtz kind of paisley floral stencil on here. Now it wasn't big enough to cover the entire thing, so I'm actually just doing pieces of it at a time, and the nice thing about this stencil is it lines up perfectly. And I did end up only doing one side of each of these. So from one side, you will see the black, and from the other side, you will see this black with the paisley print on top of it. I may end up doing the other side eventually, but for now, once I was finished with this, I just sealed both of them and used some command strips to hang these in my doorway between my dining room and my foyer. For this project, I found this wood calendar frame at my thrift store, and I thought that this would be perfect to turn into a clock. I actually already had this clock stencil, which I got from Amazon, and it fit perfectly on here. So that's what I'll be using to actually do the design of the clock on here. But before I could turn this into a clock, I wanted to paint it. So I am using some Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. And I'm just going to give this one good coat for now because I do want to decorate this a little bit. Since there was extra room on this calendar frame, I decided to use some of these scrap pieces of trim that I had from doing the project last week on that privacy window. And so I just cut down 2 pieces for that. And then this is a little wood decorative piece that I got from Amazon. So I am going to use all of these pieces on here to take up a little bit of room and give it a little more decoration. And I'm just using some wood glue to attach these pieces, and then I will let that dry for about an hour. Then I'll go back in with that plaster color and go over those little decorative pieces and also give this entire thing a second coat. Then I'm going to go in with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and go over all of those little detailed pieces. I also ended up just using what was left over on my brush of the Rub and Buff and going along all the edges of the frame. Then I'm going to use that stencil that I showed you at the beginning to make the actual clock piece, but I accidentally kind of bent this stencil a little bit, so I am going over it with a little bit of Mod Podge first, just to try to prevent a lot of bleeding underneath of this stencil. I ended up going in with some black chalk paint to go over this stencil with a little stencil brush, and I'm just trying to dab as much of the paint off of the brush as possible so that I can try to prevent the bleeding. The Mod Podge trick didn't really do too great on this just because I had bent the stencil. So as you can see, I'm kind of having to hold this down as I'm doing it. I was actually kind of surprised when I took the stencil off that it looked as good as it did. I did have a little bit of bleeding near the top portion in places, and I ended up trying to go back in with that plaster color and go over a lot of the bleeding that you could really see. I didn't fix everything, but just the stuff that was really visible. I purchased this really inexpensive little clock kit from Amazon. It actually came with 3 different types of hands you can choose from, but all I had to do was drill out the center little piece here so that I could put this clock mechanism together. I've really been wanting to make a chessboard for a while now, and I actually came across this one on eBay, and it is antique, old, hand-painted, and perfect. So I wanted to try to do this one. And to start this project, I just grabbed an old cutting board from the thrift store, and I'm gonna start by measuring out this cutting board and figuring out how to make the board. So I had to do a little bit of math for this because the board is longer than it is wide, and a typical chessboard is 64 squares. So once I figured out the measurements, then I just used a ruler and a pencil to start marking out my lines horizontally and vertically. Now at this point, or actually even before this, I honestly should have gone ahead and stained this board. I knew I wanted it darker. I was just so excited to start painting the squares that I completely skipped that part until later. So I will get back to that in just a little bit, but as you can see here, I'm just taking a small paintbrush and some Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, and I am hand painting all of my squares. Now for this color, I did end up doing 2 coats, and as you can see, I'm doing it pretty quickly. I'm not really concerned at all about making these perfect because I want it to look a little messy, if that makes sense, and more like the inspiration and how every square was just not perfectly made. And as you can see here, I do go back in and stain my board. I'm just using some watered down paint that I mixed up to a color that I liked. Then of course, because I forgot this step, I did have to go back in and do the white squares at the edges again. For the other squares, I'm actually just going to use 1 coat of my black chalk paint. And the reason I'm only doing 1 coat is I'm actually going to wipe some of this back off of the board later. And just like with the plaster color, I am just hand painting this. Again, not concerned about how messy it looks. Then once all the paint was dry, I'm just going to take some fine grit sandpaper and go over the entire thing. And you'll notice as I'm doing this, the sandpaper is actually bringing some of that black onto the plaster color. Then we're going to continue to age this even more. I'm adding some used coffee grounds on top of here and just spreading it all over this board and kind of tapping it into the board as I'm doing it. Then I'm going to spritz this with a little bit of water just to make sure all of those coffee grounds are nice and wet. I ended up letting this set for a couple hours before brushing off the coffee grounds, but it still was not aged enough for me. So I'm taking some antiquing wax and just kind of dry brushing the antiquing wax over this. And I also watered down a little bit of antiquing wax, and I'm going to go over all of this with that as well. And then I'll let this sit for a little while and just wipe it off with a paper towel. Then I'm going to go back in with the antiquing wax and just go over the black boxes. Again, I'm just going to let that sit for a little while, and then I'm going to take a wet rag and go over the entire thing. And as I'm doing this, because I only painted the 1 coat of that black chalk paint, some of the chalk paint is coming off as I'm doing this, and then it looks even more worn and you can see a little bit of the board underneath. This project is inspired by these iron embossed butterfly wall art pieces from Antique Farmhouse. To start this project, I just grabbed a scrap piece of wood. This is actually just a piece of wood I found at the thrift store. I'm just going to use some of my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, and I'm going to go over this with a pretty heavy coat, just one coat for now. And after I add the butterflies, then I'll do a second coat. For the butterflies, I grabbed some of these stencils that I got from Amazon. It comes with a large pack of just different butterflies in it. So I chose 3 that I really liked, and I'm going to start by taping one of those down to the bottom, and then I'm going to use some of this Dollar Tree spackling and my little Cricut spatula. I'm going to spray some water down in that spackling. I want it to be a paste consistency, and then I'm going to use that spatula and smooth this out over the butterfly stencil. And if your spackling is too dry, it won't spread as easily, but if you've got the right consistency, it should just kind of spread like butter, and you want to make sure that you are covering that entire stencil with pretty much an even layer, or as even as possible. Once I was finished, I just very carefully and slowly removed the stencil. For the top and the middle one, I actually made it a little bit easier on myself. I cut those stencils down just a little bit to make them fit evenly, and then I was able to tape those together and then just add a few little pieces of tape here and there where the board was showing through, and I spread the spackling over both of those at the same time. Then just like before, once I had it spread out evenly, I just very carefully removed both of those stencils. Then I just let that dry for a few hours until the spackling had hardened. And I'm going to go over this entire thing with one more coat of that Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. And as I'm going over this, I am just being very gentle over the spackling. After the chalk paint dried, then I'm going to go in with some European Gold Rub and Buff and a little brush, and I'm just going to kind of highlight over the butterflies in certain areas, and also around the board I will just do the edging with this Rub and Buff. This project is inspired by this rustic wood cookbook stand from Antique Farmhouse. I just really loved the older wood, and I found this sign at my local thrift store. Now, of course, this front part is already painted, but when I flipped this sign over, it had this gorgeous wood. I removed the hangers from the back of it, and then I just cut this down to the size that I wanted. I also ended up cutting off a little piece from the extra part of it, and this is going to be the kickstand for the back of it. Since this back part was already painted, I'm not too concerned about it. No one is really going to see this backside, so all I'm going to do is go over where it was already painted black and just try to stay within those lines. Use some of my black chalk paint to just cover that. Now, this wood is gorgeous as is, and you could just leave it, but I wanted to add just a little pretty detail to the front of it. Nothing super crazy to cover up the wood detail, but I did want to add this little floral stamp kind of in just 2 corners of it. And I got this stamp from Amazon, and I'm just using my archival ink. Now, because this board does have a lot of texture in it, I'm not using a stamping block. I'm just using my fingers and my hands to kind of press in all of those details. So I just did a little bit on the bottom corner, and then on the top corner, you can kind of see I left the stamp hanging off a little bit. And because this wood has variations of color and lots of texture, this is a really subtle little decorative piece to it. Now, instead of cutting another piece of wood for the bottom part and doing this handle the way that it was done from the inspiration, I just decided to use the handle itself as the bookrest. And I actually got this handle in a pack of I think 10 from Amazon, and I just had it left over from a project I did in my foyer. To attach it to the board, I'm just using a masking tape hack. I just broke off a piece of masking tape that was about the size of my board, and then I'm gonna mark where those holes are. I'll measure and make sure everything's centered, then pre-drill my holes so that I can screw this handle in. Then to finish it off, I just need to add the little kickstand handle, and I forgot to mention I did cut this at a 45 so that it would kind of lean back a little bit. I'm just using some wood glue to start to attach this, and then I just added in a screw through there into the board. For this project, I picked up this old spoon rack from the thrift store, and I decided to turn this into a measuring cup holder for my kitchen. So I did remove these two pieces so that I could hang my measuring cups. And these are just tacked on with a few nails, so they were easy to just pop off of there. And I'm just gonna set these aside for a little bit later because I'm definitely not gonna throw these out. We're gonna be using them in another project. Now, I actually didn't mind this wood color, but because I removed those two pieces, I needed to paint over this since the coloring didn't match. So I'm just going to go over this with one coat of Waverly Black chalk paint, but I am leaving the edges the wood color, and I'm also leaving those two pieces the wood color as well. And then because I did really like that wood color, I wanted some of it to show through. So as my paint was drying, I just grabbed some wet paper towels and I'm gonna wet distress this whole thing. Not only will this let some of the wood show through, but it also gives it a bit of an aged old look. Once that's completely dry, I am really into the whole vintage hand-painted look right now, so I want to make some little vines across this entire thing. So I'm using my pencil to just draw out those vines in a continuous pattern all the way up the spoon rack. My goal is to have some dark green vines going all the way up this, so since I am painting on a black background, I need to do a lighter color green first. So here, that is just what I'm doing, taking some of my light green paint and a small brush and going over all those pencil lines. Then once that is completely dry, I am going to mix some regular green paint with a little bit of black paint to make a dark green and go back over all of those lines. And since I have that light green paint underneath here, it will make that green color pop out more. Then once I've completed that, I will go back in with that light green color and do a bunch of leaves on my vine. And just like before, I am going to go in with that darker green color and cover all of those leaves. Then I'm going to let all of this completely dry, and because the wood on here does have a little bit of a sheen, I want to blend in my painting with that. And also because this is going to be used in my kitchen, I want to be able to clean this. So I am sealing this with some dishwasher safe Mod Podge. And this is going to give it that little bit of a gloss finish that I wanted, but also I'll be able to clean this. Then to finish this up, I just lined up my measuring cups where I wanted them on this spoon rack. And then to hang these, I'm just going to use some little gold hooks that I can screw into those wood pieces. For this project, I'm going to be using some spindles. If you already have some spindles laying around, you can just use those, even if they are different kinds of spindles. But for this, I went to Lowe's and I picked up 4 spindles for around $2 each. These are about 3 feet long, and I cut down 2 of these, leaving about 1.5 to 2 inches on both edges. Then I gave everything a quick little light sanding just to get off any rough pieces from these. I'm going to start by toning down the yellow in these. I do like the wood look of them, but I'm just going to use some of my homemade wax, which is just some Waverly clear wax mixed with a little bit of tan paint. And I'm just going to use a dry rag and go over all 4 of these pieces. Then I'll set them aside and let them completely dry. Then I want to age these up a little bit, so I'm going to use some of my homemade black wax, which is just antiquing wax mixed with a little bit of black acrylic paint and a fluffy brush, which I'm just going to put a tiny bit of this black wax on there, and I'm going to dab most of it off onto a paper plate, so that way this is just getting down into all that wood grain and really aging up this wood. I also concentrated this black wax into random spots all over this just to give it even more of a vintage look. Once it's dry, then I'm going to start marking where I want to drill holes so that I can turn this into a blanket ladder. I measured down about 1.5 inches down each post, and I'm going to use my drill and pre-drill holes all the way through those pieces. For the smaller pieces that are going to go in between, I'm just going to pre-drill my holes in the centers. And once I had those holes drilled in, then I could just add some screws to turn this into a blanket ladder. And to finish it off, I'm just going to add some D-rings to the top of here to hang it. For this next project, I picked up this little box from my thrift store, and as you can see, it's a little damaged and a little worn. It even had a broken hinge, and it's definitely not my style, but I wanted to make this over into a cute little recipe box. So the first thing I had to do was take this all apart, which was no easy feat because all 8 of the screws for the hinges were not only painted over, but they were stripped, and then I also removed that rope and little float on top. Then I went in with some of my Waverly chalk paint and gave this 3 good coats of the paint. And once those 3 coats were finished, I wanted to, like I said, make this more my style. So I'm using one of these craft treat stencils that I get from Amazon. And I wanted to make this more vintage looking French cottage. So luckily this fit perfectly on this box. So here I am just taking some painter's tape and taping my stencil down. And then I grabbed some Dollar Tree spackling, added a few drops of water into this to make it more of a paste consistency, and then I used my little Cricut spatula from Dollar Tree and I am smoothing this all over that stencil. I like to say, as a rule of thumb, to make sure you cover your stencil completely, and then once you remove it, you'll have a beautiful raised stencil. Now for the top of this, I did fill in those holes with some of that spackling, and then I'm again using that same stencil. And the great thing about this stencil is if you turn it around, it actually lines up with the top of the stenciling that you just did. So this ended up working out quite perfectly, and I just turned it around and did the same exact thing on the top. Now, before I put this all back together, I wanted to cover the inside of the lid. So I'm using some of this felt velvet paper that I get from Amazon, and it is self-adhesive. So all I had to do was just trace out the lid and then pop this onto the inside of that top piece. And that was really just to cover up those holes. Now, since the box had broken hinges, I'm actually just replacing them with these hinges. I got a big package of them from Amazon, and they come in different sizes, and this one happened to have the exact size of this box, so I just added that on there. Now, once I had it all back together, I realized I wasn't a huge fan of how the edges just kind of stopped on here, and I felt like it just needed a little more detail and to finish it off. So I'm using some of my air dry clay and one of my Amazon silicone molds to make little edge pieces. I ended up having to do 3 of these to fit that bottom piece and then the lid as well. But as you can see, I just laid it down with some gel super glue, and then right there where the lid is, I cut that so that the top piece would kind of meet there and line up with the bottom piece. So as you can see, once I had the top piece glued down, there was still a little gap there at the very top, and that's where I used my third piece and just kind of cut that piece down to line up with those. I also wanted to add a handle back to the top of this, so I'm using this little drawer pull that I got from Home Depot. I picked up a bunch of these. They were on clearance, and it was copper, but I ended up using some rub and buff on it. Then all I had to do was just drill down into the top of my lid and add this little handle. I also decided that I wanted to add a little tag on the front of this box that says recipes. So this is actually a little tag from a Dollar Tree picture frame that I just had in my stash. So I'm going to start by taking this little tag and using some of my European Gold Rub and Buff on it just to make it cohesive with the handle that I just put onto the box. Then before I put the tag on, I'm taking some more of that Rub and Buff with my stenciling brush, and I'm just going over this entire box, making sure that I really get those details. Then once I'm done with that, I am moving on to making that recipe tag. This is a piece of scrapbook paper. I got a whole bunch of these from Amazon. And then this is a rub-on transfer that I got from Dollar Tree. So I'm going to use the little piece that says recipes, and I'm just going to rub that onto my scrapbook paper. Then I just used the tag to trace around that so I could cut it down to fit the tag. And all I had to do was then add this to the front of my box. I've been looking for a desk organizer for a few months now, and I finally found this one at my thrift store. It is heavy, solid wood with 2 drawers and some organizational slots at the top. However, it did have a few scratches and dings on it, so the first thing I'm gonna need to do is fix all of those deep scratches, and I'm just using some wood filler to do that. So I'm going around this entire thing and filling in any of those scratches and imperfections. Then I'll let that set for a few hours. Once I set that aside, I went ahead and started working on the drawers. The first thing I did was take some painter's tape and tape around the inside edge because I'm not actually going to paint the inside, just the outside, and I didn't want to get any paint in there. I also decided that I wanted to change the knobs on here, so you can see I'm filling in those knob holes with some more of that wood filler. I let that dry for a little while, sanded it down, and then I'm going in with some Waverly chalk paint in the color moss for this. Of course, typically I would use white, but I do have a lot of green in my house, and this color is just absolutely beautiful once it dries down. And once this larger piece was done curing with that wood filler, then I did sand it down really good, and I'm going back in with that same moss green color. Once everything was dry, I of course wanted to add a little bit of pretty detail on here. So I'm using these rub-on transfers from Dollar Tree, and I just picked two that I liked, and I'm actually laying it over the drawer and some of the main piece and just kind of rubbing it all over that. Now these transfers work a lot better if you tape them down because they will move on you, so just be sure to do that. Now you may also notice I replaced those little knobs with those little vintage handles that I got from Amazon, and then finally, to add just a little more pretty detail to this, I'm just using these brass corners, and I put these at the top and the bottom. For this project, I'm going to be using these candle sconces that I found at the thrift store, and I'm actually going to be taking off the candle part, but you will see me paint it because obviously I'm going to keep it for future projects just in case. But I did go in and paint these with 2 coats of my white chalk paint. And in case you do a candle sconce makeover, just know that those little brass pieces at the top will pop right out. But like I said, I'm not actually going to be using the candle cups for this project, so there is a little screws down in there, and you can just unscrew those to remove the cups. And once everything was dry, I did go back in with a little bit of sandpaper and just roughed up some of the edges and made some little scrape marks. To decorate these, I'm going to be using this damask stencil that I got from Amazon and some Dollar Tree spackling, which I just mixed up with a few tiny drops of water, and then I'm going to use this Cricut spatula and just spread this all over the top of that stencil to get a raised texture. When you do this, you just want to make sure that you are covering that stencil completely in the area that you are using, and then once you pull that off, you can always scrape off anything that went over the edges. And you do have quite a bit of time to work with this, so if you mess up, you can always just scrape it off and start over. Once I had the first bit finished, then I did rinse off my stencil and I just lined up the pattern, and I'm going to repeat that process. And I always like to just scrape my stencil back off into my cup because you can keep that for another project. And again, once I was finished, then I went in with my finger and just kind of rubbed off excess on the edges. Now I am going to be turning my sconces into little shelves, so I picked up these wood plaques from Dollar Tree, and I decided not to use the same exact shape for both of them, just so they would be a little bit different. I also decided just to stain these, so I'm using a wet paintbrush and some of my brown paint, and I went over both of these plaques with that paint and water combination. Then I will take a paper towel and wipe off any of the excess. I let that spackling dry overnight, and then I went in with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff and my stenciling brush and very gently brushed over this to give it the details. Then to finish it off, I just used some wood glue to attach those shelves to the candle sconces. For this next project, I picked up this vintage perpetual calendar from my thrift store, and it had all its pieces with it, which is very rare for me to find, if I find these at all, so I definitely wanted to pick this up and make it over. Now, I'm not sure what was at the top of this before. I think it was a clock, but it did have 3 screw holes, so I went ahead and filled those in with some wood filler. I let the wood filler dry for a few hours and then sanded this down. I decided to use the color plaster in my Waverly chalk paint on this, and I don't know if I've ever really mentioned this, but I do keep a little spray bottle of water near my crafting stuff so that when I'm using chalk paint, I can spray my project down first, and it just helps the chalk paint glide more smoothly, and you also don't have to use as much of the chalk paint because it makes it a little thinner. For this piece, I ended up doing just 2 coats of the plaster chalk paint. Now, since this is a calendar, I of course wanted to make this interchangeable for seasons and holidays up here at the top. So I found this little square frame at the thrift store, and I thought this would fit perfectly up here. And then I'm also going to be using 2 of these little wood planks from Dollar Tree, and I'm just going to make these interchangeable, like I said, for different holidays and seasons. Now, these little wood planks were just a little big for my frame, so I did end up using my miter box saw to cut these down so that they would fit. I sanded both pieces down after I cut them, and then again, I'm just using a wet paint brush with some of my brown paint to stain both of these. Once they were dry, I'm going to be using some of my clear stamps to make the front and back sides of these. One for spring and summer, one for fall, Halloween, and one for Christmas. But I'm also realizing now that I completely forgot about Easter, so I will probably make a few more of these. But to make this frame so that I can change those in and out and flip them over, I'm using some of these little Velcro tabs that I got from Dollar Tree. And even though they do have the sticky backing, I'm using some gel super glue to attach the first little pieces to the frame just to make sure that they do stay on, because the adhesive on the back of these isn't the best, but you definitely want to make sure that you let this glue dry completely before attaching the other side to this. Now, once it is completely dry and I don't have to worry that these 2 pieces are going to get glued together, then I'm going to attach the opposite side onto here, and I'm going to add just a small tiny little dot of super glue to the center of these, and then flip this over and attach it to the calendar. Again, you'll want to let that glue dry completely before taking this on and off of here. Then all I had to do was just add my little months and my days back onto here. And for the days of the week, I could actually still see a small little imprint of the days of the week that was on here before I painted it. So I just kind of used those letters and went back over it with one of my black markers. I always grab books at my thrift store, especially if they are really pretty. This one happens to be a Reader's Digest book, and I just thought that the pages were really pretty and it was thick enough for me to make a vase with. If these colors would have gone with the rest of my decor, I definitely would have left this book the way it was because it was a pretty design. But unfortunately, since I have so much green in my house, I can't have blue in here because it just clashes too much. So I'm going to cover this with some of my green and white floral scrapbook paper. The first thing I needed to do was remove all the pages from the book very carefully because we are going to be putting these pages right back into this book once I cover it. Now, if you find a book that is already pretty and fits your style, you can definitely skip this step. Now I'm just going to be covering that front part and back part and leaving the spine of the book because I will end up painting that later, which I probably should have done before I covered it with the scrapbook paper. But here I am just kind of measuring out where I need to cut the paper, and then I'll use my paper cutter to cut those pieces down. Then I'm going to use a light even layer of Mod Podge on the front and the back side of this to put those papers onto this book. I also left a little bit hanging over the edges so that I could fold those over. Then I just used some more Mod Podge to make sure those were nice and clean. And it was at this point that I decided to paint that spine of the book, and I just used some Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster to do that. Like I said, I probably should have done this before I put the scrapbook paper on, and I did try to be very careful and not get a ton on the scrapbook paper, but I wasn't too concerned because I am going to cover that. While I'm letting the spine dry, I am going to start working on the book pages. Again, I wanted to make this into a vase, so I'm actually using a box cutter. You could use an X-Acto knife for this too, but I'm kind of just cutting out a long rectangle through a few sheets in the middle. I just kind of pulled out the sheets that I wanted to do, and you can see I put a little piece of paper there to know where to stop doing it, but I just kept going through and cutting out the pages. Now with this box cutter or an X-Acto knife, you can do quite a few sheets at once, so it really goes by pretty quickly, but I just kept doing it until I was happy with the size of the hole that's going to be in the center of this. And as you can see, it's not perfect, but it doesn't matter because we're going to be putting flowers in this anyway. Now, after I finished cutting my little rectangles in the pages, I went through, I didn't do every sheet, just every few sheets with a glue stick and glued those pages together. Again, you don't have to do every sheet, just make sure that you're doing at least every 5 or 6 sheets and pressing those and making sure they're all nicely glued together. Then I closed that book up really nice and tight, and I'm gonna just use some basic school glue and go around all the edges, the sides, the top, and the bottom with a paintbrush and that school glue. And then I'm gonna clamp this book together to let that dry. Once all that glue has dried, then I'm going to take some super glue and I'm going to glue this book back into the cover. And since this is a vase and we're not going to want it to open anymore, I'm going to glue that front cover to the first page and the back cover to the back page. Then I'm going to cover up any of the paint that got to the scrapbook paper, but also give this a little more detail with some of my air dry clay and one of my clay molds. I'm just making this long decorative piece, and I'm gonna attach one piece to the front of my book and one piece to the back. And again, that's just gonna hide any paint that got onto the scrapbook paper, but also just make this a little more decorative. Then finally, I thought my book needed a title, so I'm using this rub-on transfer from Dollar Tree that just says Wildflower. I picked up this silverware box from the thrift store and I just thought it was really pretty. It had a lot of details around the edges of this box, and I thought I could use it to store some of my candles and also use it for a riser. As you could see just now, I had already ripped out the inside. It was this really worn and old and dingy velvet fabric, but I did keep the inside to use for a template later. But before I start working on the inside, I actually want to work on the box itself, and I decided to try this easy off little hack to get the stain off of the box. I'm using the fume-free kind. I don't really care for strong fumes, so this was best. It kind of smells citrusy, but I still did this outside, and I just sprayed this entire box with a really good coat of this oven cleaner, and then I'm going to let this sit out in the sun for about 30 to 45 minutes. And you really just want to wait until the oven cleaner is completely dry on whatever you're working with. And then I'm just taking a bowl of soapy water and a scrub brush, and I'm gonna scrub this really good. And as you can see, a lot of that orangey stain is coming off of here as I'm doing this. This is quite messy, so I do recommend laying something down underneath it. I'm just using some trash bags under mine. And again, just going over this a couple times, scrubbing it as good as I could. And then I just used a rag to wipe off a lot of the excess once I got this really nice and clean. If it's nice and warm out, you can spray this with your hose pipe if you wanted to make it easier for you. But I just kept cleaning mine and changing out my water until I got all of that oven cleaner off of there, and then I rinsed off the soapy water with just a clean bowl of water. And I know the box still looks a little orange, but that is just because it is wet. Once I left this sitting in the sun for about 30 minutes, this is what it ended up looking like. Now you're going to want to let this completely dry in the sun, and when I brought it back in, there was still a little bit of parts on here. You can see these darker areas that had a little bit of stain on it. I could have gone back in and just did a second coat if I wanted to get the rest of that off, but I honestly kind of liked it having a little bit of that stain left over. It gave it a really worn, natural look. Now, as I was doing this process, the bottom of this box was actually just a piece of cardboard, and since it got wet, it kind of just fell apart, and I ended up having to replace the bottom. I just used a piece of MDF sheet that I had already on hand to replace that. And now to work on the inside of the box, I'm going to be using this fabric I had. I actually got this curtain from the thrift store, and I ended up making some cafe curtains for my kitchen and had a lot of material left over, so I used the previous inside of the box as a template, as I mentioned before, and I started cutting down the pieces to fit into the box. I'm starting with the side pieces that will go on the inside of the box, and I just cut down a piece of fabric that I could fold over, and there would be a little bit of excess at the bottom, and then I hot glued it and folded it over so that the top would be a nice clean edge. Once I had all my side pieces made, then I'm going to start hot gluing these to the sides of the inside of the box, and I'm just making sure that this top part reaches right at the top of the box, and you can see that little bit of excess I left at the bottom of this, and that's so the insert that I place in the bottom will cover that. So I just worked my way around the box, doing the sides first and then the front and the back piece. And once all my side pieces were in, then I can start working on the insert for the bottom of this. And again, using the old piece of the bottom as a template, I'm actually going to replace this with some Dollar Tree cutting boards instead of using cardboard, which was what the original inserts were made of, just because I had these on hand and they were already a good length. I just had to cut down the sides a little bit to fit. And I ended up making two of these, one for the bottom of the box and then one for the top. Then I'm just going to lay my inserts on top of that fabric that I'm going to be using, and I marked it just a little bigger than the insert that I made so that I can wrap this around that piece of cutting board. Then I'm just going to pull that excess over the backside of the cutting board and hot glue it down to that backside. And to tuck those little corners in, I just made sure that when I hot glued it, it was kind of tucked at an angle so you wouldn't see those edges. Then I just placed this insert down into the bottom of the box, and I finished off the top part by doing the same exact steps of the side pieces first and then the large insert. And to finish this box off, I just wanted to add a vintage handle to the front of it. This is one I just got off of Amazon, and I just had to measure where the holes needed to go, and then I attached this with some screws. And because the oven cleaner hack worked so well on my box, I decided to try it on this darker stained little book rack that I found at the thrift store. So I repeated the process of using the oven cleaner. This time I just used an old dishpan that I had, since this was a smaller piece, and just sprayed it really good with that oven cleaner and let it set until it was dry. Now, because this was a darker stained wood, I wasn't sure how good this was going to work on here, but I did want to test it. And once I rinsed it off and scrubbed it, as you can see, it didn't work quite as well, and there was still a lot of that dark stain left on here. So I did end up having to repeat the process a second time on the darker stain. But once I did it the second time and let it set in the sun, this is what it ended up looking like. Again, you can see there's still just a little bit of the dark stain in a lot of the crevices, and I could have kept going and completely got all of this off of here, but again, I kind of liked the look of it. Now, for this book rack, I did want to add some details to it, so I decided to use this pretty floral stamp that I had because I really love the look of a black stamp or black accent on raw wood. And since I'm using a larger stamp, I just wanted to make this easier on myself, so I did end up taking this apart to do the stamping. And I didn't have a clear acrylic block big enough for this stamp actually, so I just went with it and did the best I could. I put the stamp on the block in the center and then just used my fingers around the edges to get the ink on there and then to press it down onto the wood piece. And once I had the large piece done, then I also wanted to use this stamp on the little side pieces, but just using the top portion of this stamp. And again, taking this apart just made this process so much easier. And then all I had to do was just put this book rack back together.